"Move out of the way," the officer snapped, his eyes cold and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. He stood there, uniform crisp, a smirk plastered on his face as he glared at the woman blocking her path at the supermarket checkout line. She held a few grocery items in her hands, nothing out of the ordinary, but that didn't stop him. He didn't see her groceries. He didn't even see her as a person. All he saw was someone he could humiliate. "Trying to use these fake coupons, huh?" he said, raising his voice so everyone around could hear. A few heads turned, people paused, watching, but nobody stepped in. That's how you people get by, isn't it? Always trying to cheat the system. She froze, her eyes wide, disbelief mixing with a flash of anger. She wasn't trying to cheat anything. The coupons were valid. She had checked them carefully, but in that moment she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't about coupons anymore. It was about power, and he was making sure everyone saw who had it and who didn't. "Sir, I'm just trying to pay for my groceries," she said, her voice calm but trembling slightly, trying to hold on to her dignity. But he wasn't listening. He stepped closer, towering over her, his smile widening as if he was enjoying every second of this. "Of course you are," he sneered, leaning in, "but I'm not sure we want your kind here, you understand? So why don't you just put those down and leave before I have to make this official?" For a second there was silence, thick and heavy, as if the whole store was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to decide whether to push back or walk away. She could feel all the eyes on her, judging, whispering, and in that moment she felt small, helpless. But then something shifted. As she opened her mouth to speak, determined to stand her ground, there was a sudden commotion at the entrance of the store. Someone was walking in, moving quickly, and as he approached, the officer's smirk faded, replaced by a look of confusion, then alarm. The man was wearing a dark suit, sharp and authoritative, and he was heading straight for them. Without hesitation, he stepped in between the woman and the officer, putting himself right in the middle of the standoff. For a moment, nobody said a word. The tension was thick, suffocating. And then the man spoke, his voice calm but filled with a quiet, deadly intensity. "What's going on here?" The officer hesitated, his bravado crumbling, as if he suddenly realized he had pushed too far. "Nothing," he stammered, trying to recover, but it was clear to everyone around that something had shifted, that the tables were turning and fast. "Oh, it's something," the man said, stepping closer, his eyes locked on the officer's. "I think it's time we had a little talk, don't you?" The officer's eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but there was none. The man in the suit wasn't backing down, and suddenly the power dynamic had changed completely. The woman was no longer the one on the defensive, and the officer could feel the control slipping through his fingers. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread, for phones to come out, recording everything as the man in the suit began questioning the officer, digging deeper. And with each question, the officer grew more and more nervous. It was as if the floor was being pulled out from under him, and he was scrambling to keep his balance. But the man didn't stop. He pressed on, relentless, and soon it became clear why this wasn't just about a simple confrontation in a supermarket. This was about something much, much bigger. The officer, now visibly shaken, tried to maintain his composure, but it was useless. The man in the suit wasn't just any bystander. He had authority, and he was using it. "Why were you harassing her?" the man asked, his tone still calm, but now with an edge of steel. The officer tried to deny it, but his voice cracked, his words stumbling over themselves. "You thought nobody would notice, didn't you? You thought you could get away with it." As the crowd around them grew, more people started to murmur, whispering, recording the scene, becoming a spectacle. And the officer, the one who had started this whole thing, so confident, so sure of himself, was now the one on trial, exposed, with no place to hide. But then, just as he tried to find a way out, the man in the suit did something nobody expected. He pulled out a badge, flipping it open for everyone to see. It wasn't just any badge, it was a federal badge, and as it caught the light, the entire room seemed to gasp, as if collectively realizing that everything had just changed. "I'm with the FBI," he said, his eyes never leaving the officers, "and I know exactly who you are." For a split second, the officer's face went pale, and then, like a dam breaking, the truth started pouring out. People in the crowd exchanged glances, some in shock, others nodding as if it all made sense now. The officer wasn't just a bully. He was hiding something. Something dark, something he thought would never see the light of day. But now, under the gaze of the man in a suit, there was no escaping it. And as the realization hit him, the officer's confident mask shattered, leaving nothing but a man desperately trying to hold on to the last scraps of control. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice was weak, his words barely audible. "Oh, I think you do," the man said, stepping even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, but still loud enough for the crowd to hear. "And I'm going to make sure everyone else does too." It was at that moment, with the whole supermarket watching, that the officer's past began to unravel. There were murmurs, people exchanging looks of disbelief, as the man in the suit began listing off crimes, things the officer had done that nobody knew about, or at least nobody had dared to speak up against. Corruption, extortion, violence. The kind of things that can only stay hidden for so long before they explode. And now, right here in this ordinary grocery store, it was all coming to the surface. The officer's hands began to shake, his eyes wide with fear as he realized just how much trouble he was in. And the woman, the one who had been humiliated, stood there watching as the scales of justice began to tip back in her favor. She had felt powerless at the beginning, but now she could see the end of this, and it wasn't going to be the way the officer had planned. But this was just the beginning. What did the man in the suit know, and how far was he willing to go to bring justice to light? One thing was for sure, the officer's days of hiding were over. And as the story unfolded, it became clear that the real confrontation was just starting, and it was about to get a whole lot more intense. So what exactly did the man in the suit find? What secrets were hidden behind the officer's uniform, and how far would this clash of power and justice go? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started, and trust me, you won't believe how it ends. Hey, what's up? Before we dive into today's story, we just want to take a moment to say something important. Here on Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or hate. We believe in equality, respect, and justice for everyone, no matter who you are or where you come from. We hope that stories like this one can shed light on real issues and spark conversations that lead to change. So, sit back, relax, and get ready for a story that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. And if you enjoy what we do, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for the support, and enjoy the story. Maurice was never the type to seek attention. Growing up in Memphis, he had learned to navigate a world that often tried to silence him, and he did it with a quiet strength. Now, as an agent of the FBI, he used that same strength to fight back, not with loud gestures, but with calculated precision. He had built his career on discipline, working tirelessly to move up the ranks, and was respected for his cool-headedness and sharp instincts. Maurice wasn't one to raise his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. He was meticulous, whether he was at work or at home. Even when he was out of his dark suit and crisp white shirt, he carried an air of authority that was hard to ignore. But those who knew him well, like his wife Lisa, saw the softer side that lay beneath, the side that would come home after a long day and talk about everything but work. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew when to leave his badge at the door. Lisa was his grounding force. She was everything Maurice admired, intelligent, empathetic, and fierce when she needed to be. She worked as a community advocate, focusing on education reform in neighborhoods that were often overlooked. Where Maurice was calm and reserved, Lisa was expressive and passionate. Together they balanced each other out, a partnership built on mutual respect and deep, enduring love. Maurice admired Lisa's strength. She wasn't afraid to stand up for herself or anyone else. She was a fighter, and he knew it was one of the reasons he had fallen for her. But he also knew it made her a target in a world that didn't always see her strength the way he did. Memphis was a city with a complex soul. It was full of life and culture, with music drifting through the streets from jazz clubs on Beale Street to local gospel choirs echoing through Sunday mornings. But beneath its vibrant exterior there were cracks, deep, systemic issues that had been festering for decades. Maurice was no stranger to these issues. He had grown up seeing them, and now, as an agent, he often found himself dealing with the consequences. It wasn't just about crime. It was about inequality, about the kind of quiet, insidious prejudice that didn't always make the headlines but hurt just as deeply. It was a hot, humid afternoon when Lisa decided to stop by the supermarket on her way home from a community meeting. She had a list of things she needed to grab for dinner, and after a long day of advocating, she was looking forward to a quiet evening. As she moved through the aisles, she couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. The supermarket was busy, people moving in and out, but she liked the routine of it. It felt normal, ordinary, and that was a comfort she cherished after a day of heated discussions and debates. But normal was a fragile thing, and it didn't take much to shatter it. Lisa was almost at the checkout when she heard a voice, sharp and condescending, cutting through the background noise. She didn't recognize it, but she could feel its weight, a sense of authority that demanded attention. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see those coupons." She turned, surprised, to see a police officer standing there blocking her path. His name tag read Officer Barnes, and there was something about the way he looked at her that made Lisa's skin crawl. He wasn't just looking, he was judging. He scanned her from head to toe, as if trying to decide where she fit into his world. Lisa had experienced looks like that before, but this one felt more dangerous, like a challenge. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You heard me," Barnes replied, his lips curling into a smirk. "Those coupons. I've seen people like you try to pull this before, trying to get something for nothing. Let's see if they're real." Lisa felt her cheeks flush, not with embarrassment, but with anger. She had done nothing wrong, and here was this man speaking to her as if she were a criminal. "They're valid," she said, holding her ground. "I double-checked them." Barnes stepped closer, and she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "That's so," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "because I don't see why you'd need them unless you couldn't afford to pay. Maybe you should put some of that back." The words stung, not because of what they meant, but because of how he said them. It wasn't about the coupons. It was about making her feel small, less than. Lisa's mind raced, trying to think of the best way to handle the situation. She had seen this kind of power play before, but never so up close, so direct. She wanted to push back, to tell him off, but she could see the way people were starting to watch, their eyes darting back and forth, not quite sure what to do. Some looked away, pretending not to notice, while others seemed almost eager, as if this was some kind of entertainment. The store clerk hesitated, glancing at Barnes, then at Lisa, unsure of which way this would go. Maurice was still at work, going through reports at his office, when he got a call. It was a friend, someone who had been in the store and seen what was happening. "You might want to get down here, man," the friend said, his voice low and urgent. "It's Lisa. There's a cop giving her a hard time. It doesn't look good." Maurice's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his composure. "Where?" he asked, already reaching for his car keys. Which store? He drove faster than he should have, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what was happening. Lisa didn't back down easily, but he also knew she wasn't reckless. If she was in trouble, it wasn't because she had done something wrong. It was because someone else was trying to make her feel like she did. Meanwhile, back at the store, the situation was escalating. Barnes was enjoying this, and that was what made it all the more infuriating. Every time Lisa tried to speak, he would cut her off, louder, more aggressive, as if he was daring her to fight back. "You think you can just walk in here and do whatever you want, huh?" he said, his voice rising. "Well, I'm not letting it slide. Not today." Lisa's hands were shaking, but she held her head high. "You have no right to talk to me like this," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Barnes stepped even closer, his expression darkening. "You think you're above the law?" he said, his tone mocking. "Let me remind you, I am the law." The store felt smaller, the walls closing in as Lisa tried to hold her ground. She could feel the tension like a coiled spring ready to snap at any moment. But she also knew one thing. She wasn't going to back down. Not to him. Not to anyone. And then, just as Barnes was about to say something else, the doors of the supermarket opened, and Maurice walked in. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in everything at once, the crowd, the clerk, and Barnes standing there, leaning over Lisa with that same smug expression. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, and Maurice's calm, steady gaze seemed to unsettle Barnes. It was as if he was seeing something he didn't expect, something that made him hesitate, just for a second. But Maurice didn't say anything yet. He just walked over, placing himself between Lisa and Barnes, his presence alone enough to shift the balance of power. He was here now, and whatever was about to happen, he wasn't going to let it happen alone. Maurice stood between Lisa and Officer Barnes, his posture calm but firm, a silent declaration that this wasn't going to go on any longer. For a moment, there was a heavy stillness, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would make the next move. Barnes's eyes flickered, a mixture of surprise and defiance, but Maurice's presence seemed to unnerve him. It was clear this wasn't the reaction Barnes had expected. He was used to people cowering, backing down, but Maurice wasn't budging. "What's the problem here?" Maurice asked, his voice steady and controlled, but there was a sharp edge beneath it, like a blade hidden in velvet. Barnes hesitated, then tried to put on the same smug smile, though it was wavering now. "No problem," he said, shrugging, but his tone was laced with sarcasm. "Just handling a situation, making sure everything is in order." He glanced at Lisa, a look of disdain crossing his face. "Your wife here was trying to use some questionable coupons. I'm just doing my job." Lisa opened her mouth to protest, but Maurice gently raised a hand, signaling her to wait. He could feel her frustration, the way she was holding back, but he needed to take control of the situation, and he needed to do it carefully. "Questionable?" Maurice repeated, tilting his head slightly as if considering the word. "From what I see, she was just trying to buy groceries. Unless you're saying there's something illegal about that?" Barnes's smile twisted into a sneer. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm the one in charge here," he said, stepping forward, trying to reassert his authority. "If I think there's a problem, then there's a problem. Maybe you should tell your wife to be more careful next time." Maurice's eyes darkened, but he kept his composure. "And maybe you should learn how to do your job without harassing innocent people," he replied, his tone cutting. "Especially when you're clearly overstepping your boundaries." The tension was thick, palpable, and the crowd that had gathered was growing. People whispering, taking out their phones, recording. It was as if everyone could sense that something was about to happen, something bigger than just a confrontation in a supermarket. Maurice knew this wasn't just about Barnes's behavior. This was about power, about who thought they had it and who was willing to take it back. Barnes's face reddened, and for a moment his hands clenched at his sides. "You better watch yourself," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't want to get in the middle of this. I can make things very difficult for you." Maurice didn't flinch. "You're already making things difficult," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "And I suggest you think very carefully about your next move, officer, because I'm not going anywhere." For a moment it looked like Barnes might snap, his eyes wild, his fists tight, but then something else flickered across his face. Hesitation, maybe even fear. He took a step back, glancing around as if suddenly aware of all the eyes on him. "You don't scare me," he muttered, but his voice lacked the same confidence it had before. "I'm not trying to scare you," Maurice replied, his eyes locking onto Barnes's. "I'm trying to warn you." Lisa watched, her heart pounding, torn between relief and a simmering anger that wouldn't fade. She could see Barnes's bravado starting to crack, but she knew this wasn't over. Maurice had stepped in, but Barnes was still clinging to whatever power he thought he had left, and she could see the way he was glancing at the crowd, calculating, trying to find a way to turn this around. "You people think you can just—" Barnes started, but Maurice cut him off, his voice louder, sharper than before. "Don't," he said, and the single word was like a warning bell, echoing through the store. "You've already said enough." The store was silent, all eyes fixed on them. Barnes opened his mouth, then closed it, as if unsure what to say. For the first time he seemed to be at a loss, and Maurice seized the moment. "If there's a real issue here, we can deal with it properly," Maurice said, pulling out his phone and beginning to dial. "I can call your precinct right now, get a supervisor down here, and we can sort this out. Or you can apologize to my wife and we can all walk away from this." The threat hung in the air and Barnes stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but there was a tremor in it, something fragile. "I'm not scared of you or your badge." Maurice raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I think you should be," he said, and there was a hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "Because this is just the beginning." For a moment, Barnes just stood there, frozen, and then he did something nobody expected. He reached out and slapped the phone out of Maurice's hand, sending it clattering across the floor. The sound echoed, sharp and sudden, and the entire store seemed to gasp, a collective intake of breath, as if they couldn't believe what they had just seen. Lisa felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of shock and rage, and she stepped forward, ready to say something, but Maurice caught her arm, stopping her. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady, though there was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "He's already made his choice." Barnes glared at them, his chest heaving, his face flushed with anger. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, his words dripping with disdain. "Just because you wear a fancy suit and have a nice job, you're nothing." "You're wrong," Maurice said, his voice like steel, and for the first time Barnes seemed to falter. "This isn't about who's better. This is about what's right, and you're on the wrong side of that line." Barnes looked around, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for support, but all he saw were phones pointed at him, people watching, waiting, recording. The realization seemed to hit him, and for a moment he looked lost, as if he didn't know how he had ended up here, how he had lost control so quickly. But Maurice wasn't finished. "You can't bully your way out of this," he said, taking a step closer, his voice low but clear. "Not this time." There was a beat of silence, and then Barnes took a step back, his expression a mix of fear and anger. "This isn't over," he said, his voice barely audible, but there was a desperate edge to it, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "I can make your life hell. You think you can just walk away from this?" Maurice's eyes were cold, unflinching. "No," he said, "but I can make sure you don't walk away either." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Barnes's face twisted, a flash of something dark and panicked crossing his features. He opened his mouth to respond, but whatever he was about to say was lost as a new sound filled the air, the wail of sirens approaching, loud and clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned, looking toward the entrance, and in that moment Barnes's facade crumbled completely. Maurice didn't move, didn't react, just stood there watching, as if he had been waiting for this all along. And as the sirens grew louder, as the flashing lights reflected off the windows, it became clear to everyone that this was far from over. What had started as a simple confrontation had grown into something much bigger, something that was about to explode. And the real question was, when everything came to light, who would be left standing? The stage was set and the players were ready, but what nobody knew was just how deep the story went and just how much was about to be exposed. The secrets, the lies, the hidden truths, everything was about to come crashing down, and the fallout would be unlike anything anyone had ever seen. And Maurice, calm and composed as ever, was ready for it, because this time the truth was on his side. The store was buzzing with murmurs as the sirens grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights painting the walls with an ominous glow. Maurice stood there, unyielding, his eyes locked on Barnes, who was beginning to unravel right in front of him. The officer's confidence had drained away, replaced by a frantic, almost wild look, as if he was trying to calculate a way out, but couldn't see a clear path. He glanced around at the crowd, at the phone still recording, and then back at Maurice, who hadn't moved an inch. "You called them?" Barnes said, his voice shaking but still trying to sound threatening. "You called the cops on me?" Maurice's expression didn't change. "No," he said calmly. "I called them for you." Barnes blinked, confused, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't quite grasp what was happening. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snapped, but there was an edge of desperation now, a hint of fear. Maurice took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You said you were just doing your job," he said, his tone even, almost conversational. "But your job doesn't include harassing innocent people. Your job doesn't give you the right to intimidate or degrade someone just because you can." Barnes's eyes darted to Lisa, who was standing behind Maurice, her expression a mix of defiance and quiet rage. She didn't say anything, but the way she looked at him made it clear she wasn't afraid anymore. She had felt small before, but now, with Maurice by her side, she was done being silent. "You've been hiding behind that badge for too long," Maurice continued, his voice growing colder. "But the badge doesn't make you untouchable. It doesn't give you the right to do whatever you want." "You don't know anything about me," Barnes snapped, trying to regain control. "You don't know what I've been through, what I deal with every day." Maurice's lips twitched into a slight, humorless smile. "Oh, I know more than you think," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I know exactly who you are, Officer Barnes, and so do they." At that moment, two uniformed police officers walked through the store doors, their eyes scanning the scene before focusing on Barnes. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward, and Maurice could see a flicker of recognition pass between him and Barnes. "We got a call about an incident," the officer said, his voice steady but firm. "Officer Barnes, what's going on here?" Barnes straightened up, trying to look composed, but there was a slight tremor in his hands. "It's nothing, really," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a misunderstanding." The officer's gaze shifted to Maurice, who took a step forward, producing a card from his pocket and handing it to him. "I'm Agent Maurice Hill, FBI," he said, his voice clear and authoritative, "and I need to have a word with your colleague here." The crowd gasped, and for a moment the store was dead silent. Barnes's face went pale, and he stumbled backward slightly, his eyes widening as he stared at the card, then back at Maurice. "Your FBI?" he stammered, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Yes," Maurice said, his tone leaving no room for doubt, "and I've been looking into you for a while now, Barnes." Barnes shook his head, his mouth twisting into a sneer. "This is," he muttered, "you can't just—" "I can," Maurice interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And I did. You thought you could hide, that nobody would care about the things you've done, but you were wrong. I know about the bribes. I know about the false charges you've pressed against people who didn't have the means to fight back. I know about the threats, the intimidation, the violence." The police officer who had arrived exchanged a glance with his partner, then turned back to Barnes. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low, but there was an unmistakable tension in it. Barnes tried to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a man caught in a trap, and for a moment Maurice almost felt pity for him. Almost. Maurice turned to the crowd, making sure his voice carried to every corner of the store. "How many of you have been mistreated by this man?" he asked, his eyes scanning the faces, some of them familiar, others strangers. "How many of you have been humiliated, threatened, or forced to comply because he had a badge and thought he could get away with it?" There was a murmur, a low rumble of agreement, and then slowly one hand went up, then another and another. Maurice could see the ripple of realization spreading through the crowd, as if they were all waking up to something they had been too afraid to acknowledge before. "This isn't just about what happened today," Maurice said, his voice strong, steady. "This is about accountability. It's about making sure people like Barnes can't keep abusing their power without consequences." Barnes was trembling now, his face twisted with anger and fear. "You think you can ruin my life?" he said, his voice cracking. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "You ruined your own life," Maurice replied, his voice icy. "Every time you decided to abuse your authority, every time you thought you could use your position to hurt people instead of protect them, that was your choice." The police officers stepped forward, and Barnes flinched, as if expecting to be handcuffed then and there. "Wait," he said, raising his hands defensively. "You don't understand. It's not what it looks like." "You think this is a game?" Maurice said, his voice suddenly louder, more forceful. "You think you can lie your way out of this? We have evidence, Barnes. Records, testimonies, video footage, and trust me, it's all going to come out." For a moment, Barnes was silent, his mouth opening and closing as if he was trying to find the right words. Then slowly he started to laugh, a hollow, bitter sound. "You think anyone's going to care?" he said, his eyes wild. "I'm a cop. They'll back me up. They always do." Maurice took a step closer, his expression hardening. "Not this time," he said, "because I've made sure they can't. I've already talked to your precinct. I've talked to the DA, and they know exactly what kind of person you are." Barnes's smile faltered, and for the first time Maurice saw real fear in his eyes. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, you can't." "Yes, I can," Maurice said, his voice low but firm, "and I will." The police officers stepped forward again, and this time Barnes didn't resist. He let them take his hands, his eyes blank, as if he was finally realizing that this was really happening, that there was no escape. The crowd was silent, watching as he was led away, the weight of what they had just witnessed sinking in. As Barnes was escorted out of the store, Maurice turned to Lisa, who had been standing quietly, her hands clenched at her sides. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, the hard edge gone now, replaced by concern. She nodded, but there were tears in her eyes, not of sadness but of relief. "I'm okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Maurice reached out, taking her hand in his, and for a moment they just stood there, letting the chaos around them fade away. It had been a long, painful road, but they had made it through. And Maurice knew, as he looked at the woman he loved, that this wasn't just about Barnes. This was about all the times people like him thought they could get away with it, and all the times they wouldn't, because people like Maurice and Lisa would be there to fight back. As they turned to leave, one of the officers approached Maurice. "Agent Hill," he said, his tone respectful, "I don't think I've ever seen someone stand up to Barnes like that. We've heard rumors, but—" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Thank you for doing what we couldn't." Maurice nodded, his gaze steady. "It's what needed to be done." Nodded, but he didn't smile. "This isn't over," he said, glancing back at the entrance where Barnes had been taken. "There are others. We have to make sure this doesn't stop here." The officer nodded. "If you need anything, let us know. We'll be there." As Maurice and Lisa walked out of the store, the air outside felt different, lighter, as if a storm had finally passed. But Maurice knew that the fight was far from over. They had won this battle, but there would be others, and they would be ready. But for now, as they walked hand in hand through the parking lot, there was a sense of peace, a feeling that justice, even in its smallest form, was possible. And as the sun began to set over Memphis, Maurice couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The question that hung in the air, though, was how far Barnes's reach went, and how many more were like him, hiding behind their badges, waiting for their turn to fall. That was a question Maurice was determined to find the answer to, no matter what it took. As Maurice and Lisa stepped out of the supermarket, they were greeted by a crowd that had gathered outside, drawn by the commotion and the flashing lights of the patrol cars. There was a buzz in the air, a mix of curiosity, concern, and something else, a sense of hope, perhaps. For so long, people like Barnes had acted with impunity, but today, something had changed. People could feel it. Maurice felt Lisa's hand tighten in his as they walked, and he glanced over at her, catching the determined set of her jaw. She had been through hell in there, forced to endure the humiliation and aggression of a man who thought he could get away with it. But she hadn't broken. She was still standing, and now she was ready to see this through. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of pride and relief. "You really did it." Maurice shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he replied, his voice low, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "This was just the beginning." As they approached their car, a man stepped out from the crowd, his face serious. Maurice recognized him immediately. It was Detective Harris, someone he had worked with a few times before on local cases. Harris was known for being straightforward, no nonsense, and he had a reputation for not backing down from a fight, especially when it came to corruption within the force. "Agent Hill," Harris said, nodding in acknowledgement. "I heard about what happened inside. I wanted to speak with you, if you have a moment." Maurice nodded, gesturing for Lisa to wait by the car. She hesitated, then gave him a small nod, understanding that this conversation was important. Harris motioned for Maurice to follow him to the side, away from the murmuring crowd. "I'll be straight with you," Harris began, his voice quiet but intense. "Barnes isn't the only one. We've had complaints about him before, but nothing ever stuck. Every time we tried to dig, it was like running into a brick wall. But it's not just him. There are others, higher up, people who've been covering for him, making sure he stays protected." Maurice listened, his jaw tightening. He had suspected as much. Barnes's arrogance didn't come from nowhere. It was built on a system that allowed him to act without consequence. "So, what you're saying is, this goes deeper than just one bad cop," Maurice said, his tone flat but edged with tension. Harris nodded. "Deeper than you can imagine. And if you want to bring him down, really bring him down, you're going to need more than just the footage from today. You need to cut the head off the snake, not just swat at the tail." For a moment, Maurice was silent, processing the weight of what Harris was telling him. "What do you need from me?" he finally asked, his voice steady. Harris took a deep breath. "We need someone who can get the evidence. We can't. Internal affairs is practically useless." Every time they start an investigation, it gets shut down. But you, as an FBI agent, you have jurisdiction. You can pull files, get access to records that have been buried. If we can expose what Barnes and his people have been doing, we might just be able to tear the whole operation down. Maurice considered Harris's words, the enormity of what he was suggesting sinking in. This wasn't just about getting justice for Lisa anymore. It was about dismantling a system that allowed people like Barnes to thrive. "I'll do it," he said, his voice resolute. "But I need to know you're in this with me. I can't do it alone." Harris met his gaze, and for a moment Maurice saw a flicker of something, determination, but also fear. "I'm in," Harris said, his voice firm. "But we have to be smart about this. Barnes isn't going to go down without a fight, and he's got friends who are just as dirty as he is." As they spoke, Maurice felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. "I know what you're doing. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Maurice's eyes narrowed as he read the message, and he could feel the tension coiling inside him like a spring. He had expected pushback, but not this quickly, eyeing the change in Maurice's expression. Maurice showed him the message, and Harris's face darkened. "They're already trying to scare you off," he said. "That means you're on the right track." Maurice put the phone back in his pocket, his mind already working. "They can try," he said quietly, but there was a fire in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. "But they have no idea who they're dealing with." The next morning, Maurice sat in his office, his computer screen filled with files, documents, and case reports. He had spent the entire night combing through records, looking for patterns, connections, anything that could link Barnes to a larger network of corruption. It was tedious work, but Maurice had always been good at finding the details that others missed, and slowly a picture was starting to emerge. There were payments, subtle but consistent, to an account that belonged to a consulting firm with no clear business. There were cases that had been closed too quickly, suspects released without charges, and complaints against officers that had mysteriously disappeared. It was all connected, like pieces of a puzzle, and Maurice was beginning to see the outline of the full picture. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The message from the night before had been a warning, but it was also a challenge, and Maurice knew that whoever had sent it wasn't going to back off easily. He was getting close, and that meant things were going to get dangerous. Just as he was about to dig deeper, his office phone rang. He picked it up, expecting another routine call, but the voice on the other end made him sit up straighter. "You're playing a dangerous game, Agent Hill," the voice said, calm but with an underlying threat. "Barnes was just doing his job. If you keep pushing, you're going to force our hand." Maurice's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the voice just chuckled. "Someone who has a lot more to lose than you do," it replied. "Walk away, and this can all go away quietly. Keep digging, and we'll make sure you regret it." Maurice's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I don't scare easily," he said, his voice low, "and I'm not walking away." "Then you're a fool," the voice said, and then the line went dead. Maurice hung up the phone, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him. They were desperate, and that meant he was getting closer to something big, something they didn't want him to find. He didn't have time to dwell on it, though, because just then Lisa walked into his office, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. "Maurice," she said, her voice trembling, "there's something you need to see." She handed him her phone, and Maurice's heart dropped as he saw the screen. It was a video shot from outside their house, showing him and Lisa getting into their car that morning. The camera zoomed in, focusing on their faces, then panned back out. The message was clear. "We're watching you." "They're trying to scare us," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't let them win, Maurice. We can't. Maurice looked at the video, then at Lisa, and he felt a surge of anger stronger than he had ever felt before. They think they can intimidate us, that they can make us stop, he said, his voice shaking with fury. But all they've done is prove that we're on the right track. We're not backing down. Lisa reached out and took his hand, her grip firm. Then we do this together, she said, her eyes fierce, whatever it takes. By the time Maurice and Harris met later that evening, they had a plan. It was risky, but it was the only way to expose the network of corruption without tipping off Barnes and his allies. Harris had managed to get a few trustworthy officers on board, people who were sick of the way things had been and ready to see change. They would gather the evidence Maurice had found, confront Barnes, and force him to name names. But as they set their plan into motion, Maurice couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse before they got better. Barnes wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly, and whoever was backing him had already made it clear they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. It was almost midnight when Maurice received another message, this time a simple, chilling line. You should have listened. Maurice showed the message to Harris, who read it and nodded grimly. They're desperate, he said, and desperate people make mistakes. Let's make sure this is one they'll regret. Maurice replied, his eyes hard. They set off, ready to confront Barnes and force him to face the consequences of his actions. But as they drove through the dark, quiet streets of Memphis, Maurice couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Whatever was waiting for them, he knew one thing. There was no turning back now. As Maurice and Harris drove through the quiet, dark streets, the atmosphere in the car was thick with tension. The city was eerily calm, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to unfold, of what they were about to do, pressing down on him. But he was determined. He had spent too long watching people like Barnes abuse their power, and now he had the chance to make it right. There was no room for hesitation. They arrived at the precinct where Harris had arranged a late-night meeting in a secured office. Maurice had spent the past hours preparing, gathering the documents, messages, and evidence that painted a damning picture of Barnes's corruption. There was no way Barnes would be able to talk his way out of this, not with the mountain of proof that was about to be laid out in front of him. But Maurice knew that the real challenge wasn't just confronting Barnes, it was making sure the truth saw the light of day. When they entered the precinct, Harris led them down a series of dimly lit hallways to a room where two other officers were waiting. They were younger, tense but resolute, and Maurice could tell they were nervous about what was about to happen. This wasn't just about exposing a corrupt cop. It was about challenging a system that had protected men like Barnes for years. "Everyone ready?" Harris asked, his voice low but firm. The officers nodded, and Maurice saw a flicker of determination in their eyes. They weren't just here because they had been told to be. They wanted this to end as much as he did. "Barnes will be here any minute," Harris continued, glancing at his watch. "He thinks this is just a routine check-in, nothing more. But once he's in that room, we need to make sure he understands what's at stake. We need him to cooperate, and if he doesn't, we're going to have to push." Maurice nodded, taking a deep breath. "We get him to talk," he said. "We make him see that he has no other option. If he tries to deny it, we show him everything we've got. The goal isn't just to get him, it's to get everyone he's been protecting." The room was silent for a moment, the gravity of the situation settling over them. Then the door opened and Barnes walked in, looking slightly confused but still carrying that arrogant swagger. He saw Maurice, Harris, and the other officers, and his expression shifted, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the edge in his voice. "Why are you all here?" Maurice didn't waste time. "Sit down, Barnes," he said, his tone flat. We need to talk." Barnes hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "I don't have anything to say to you," he replied, but Maurice could see the uncertainty creeping in. He didn't know what was coming, and that made him nervous. "Then listen," Maurice said, sliding a folder across the table toward him. "That's a collection of every questionable action you've taken over the past few years. Bribes, false arrests, evidence tampering. It's all there. We have witnesses, bank records, video footage, and it's not just about you, Barnes. It's about the entire network you're a part of." Barnes's face went pale, and for a moment he looked like he was going to bolt, but he forced himself to stay seated. "This is insane," he said, but his voice was shaky. "You can't just make these kinds of accusations without proof." "Oh, we have proof," Harris said, leaning forward, his eyes locked on Barnes. "And if you want to see it all plastered across every news station in the city, keep playing dumb. Or you can start talking and tell us who else is involved. You cooperate, and maybe we can work something out." Barnes was silent, his mind clearly racing. Maurice could see the battle happening behind his eyes, the struggle between pride and self-preservation. For years, Barnes had operated with impunity, thinking he was untouchable. Now, he was realizing just how wrong he had been, and Maurice could almost see the gears turning in his head as he tried to figure out a way to wriggle out of this. "You don't understand how things work," Barnes said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. "If I talk, I'm done. They'll make sure I disappear, and nobody will ever know the truth. This isn't just about me. There are people out there who will make sure this goes away." Maurice leaned back, studying Barnes, trying to gauge how far he could push. "You're already done, Barnes," he said quietly. "Whether you talk or not, we're going to expose this. The only choice you have is how it ends for you. You can go down as the guy who took the fall for everyone else, or you can start naming names and give us what we need to take them down too." Barnes swallowed, and Maurice could see the fear in his eyes. This was a man who had built his entire life on control, on using fear to manipulate those around him. Now he was the one who was afraid, and it was tearing him apart. "I can't," Barnes whispered, almost to himself. "You don't know what they'll do." Harris spoke up, his voice soft but firm. "They're not the ones sitting in this room right now. We are, and if you don't cooperate, you'll be facing charges that could put you away for decades. Think about your family, your future. This is your last chance." Barnes's hands were shaking as he reached for the folder, flipping it open and scanning the pages. Boat chaired as his eyes moved over the evidence, his face growing pale with each line. It was clear that he hadn't expected them to have so much, that he had underestimated just how deep their investigation had gone. Finally, Barnes closed the folder, his hands still trembling. "What do you want to know?" he said, his voice barely audible, but there was a resignation in it, a recognition that he was cornered and there was no way out. "Start with the names," Maurice said, his voice steady. "Who's been protecting you? Who's been helping you cover this up?" Barnes hesitated, and Maurice could see the internal struggle, the fear of betrayal clashing with the realization that he was out of options. "There are people in the precinct," he said slowly, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Higher-ups. They've been making sure certain things don't get out. And it's not just them. There are people outside the force, people with connections." "Names?" Maurice pressed, his voice firm. "Give us the names." Barnes hesitated for a moment longer, then he began to speak, each name coming out like a confession, a piece of a puzzle that Maurice and Harris had been trying to put together for months. Maurice could see the other officers in the room exchanging glances, their expressions grim. This was bigger than they had imagined, and each name that Barnes revealed added to the weight of what they were uncovering. When Barnes finally finished, he looked up at Maurice, his eyes hollow. "Is that enough?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Will that get me out of this?" Maurice didn't answer right away. He had gotten what he needed, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way Barnes was trying to bargain, as if he still thought he could make a deal. "We'll see," Maurice said finally, his voice cold. "But understand this, Barnes. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about making sure this doesn't happen again. And if that means taking down every single person you just named, then that's exactly what we're going to do." Barnes slumped back in his chair, defeated, and for a moment Maurice felt a pang of something close to pity, but he pushed it aside. Barnes had chosen this path, and now he was facing the consequences. As Harris began making calls, arranging for the information to be documented and for the other names to be investigated, Maurice stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. He took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind, but the events of the night kept replaying over and over. Lisa was waiting for him outside, leaning against the car. She had insisted on coming, even though Maurice had warned her it might not be safe, but she had stood her ground, just like she always did. And Maurice knew that he wouldn't have been able to do any of this without her. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. "We got him," Maurice said, but there was no triumph in his voice, only a weary satisfaction. "He talked, gave us the names we needed. It's going to be a long fight, but we have what we need to bring this to light." Lisa's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this wasn't easy." Maurice nodded, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to feel now that it was over. Relief, anger. He had spent so long fighting to get to this moment, and now that it was here, all he could think about was how much more there was still to do. As they stood there, the night stretching out around them, Maurice's phone buzzed with another message. He pulled it out, expecting another threat, but instead it was a simple message from Harris. "Good work. It's not over, but we're closer than we've ever been." Maurice read the message, then looked up at the stars, twinkling faintly in the dark sky. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. And no matter how hard Barnes or anyone else tried to stop them, they weren't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a whirlwind of chaos and revelations. Maurice's plan, bolstered by Harris and the dedicated officers, had worked. The information extracted from Barnes was enough to trigger a full-scale investigation, not just within the precinct, but across the city. One by one, the names he had given up were brought in for questioning, their secrets dragged into the light. Barnes's confession had been the first crack, and once it was made, everything started to crumble. Corrupt officers, shady business owners, even city officials who had turned a blind eye for the right price, all of them were exposed. The network that had shielded people like Barnes for years was torn apart, and there was no escaping the consequences. As the investigation unfolded, the media caught wind of it, and soon the story was everywhere. News channels aired reports of the arrests, the scandals, the betrayal of public trust. Faces of powerful people who had once seemed untouchable were plastered across every screen, their smug smiles replaced by looks of shock and fear, shock and panic. For Maurice, it was a vindication of everything he had fought for, not just in the past few weeks, but throughout his career. But it wasn't without cost. The backlash was intense. There were attempts to discredit the investigation, to paint Maurice and Harris as overzealous, even corrupt themselves. Maurice had known it would happen. He was prepared for it. What he hadn't expected was the overwhelming support from the community. People who had been silent, who had been too afraid to speak out against Barnes and his allies, began to step forward. Stories of abuse, extortion, and intimidation surfaced, each one adding weight to the case. It wasn't just Maurice's fight anymore, it was theirs, and they were done being afraid. One day, as Maurice was leaving the courthouse after a long hearing, he found Lisa waiting for him outside. She had been by his side through it all, her quiet strength giving him the resolve he needed. But today she had a look of quiet joy, a rare, beautiful smile that made Maurice's heart swell. "They did it," she said, her voice barely concealing her excitement. "The DA's office just announced that they're moving forward with charges against everyone Barnes named. They're not backing down." Maurice felt a wave of relief wash over him, and he pulled Lisa into a tight hug, closing his eyes as he let the moment sink in. "It's happening," he whispered. "We're finally getting justice." It was true. Barnes had been stripped of his badge, his power, and was facing serious charges. In a final, desperate move, he had tried to negotiate a deal, but there was no deal to be made. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the judge made it clear that no amount of pleading would erase the years of abuse he had inflicted. He would spend the next decades behind bars, and for the first time, he was the one without control, without power. Harris, who had been at Maurice's side through the entire process, was promoted for his role in the investigation. His integrity and dedication had been instrumental in bringing down the network, and it didn't go unnoticed. He approached Maurice on the courthouse steps, extending his hand. "You did good, Agent Hill," he said, his voice filled with respect. "I don't think we could have done it without you." Maurice shook his hand, a small smile on his lips. "We did it together, Harris. This wasn't just my fight. It was everyone's." As for Lisa, the ordeal had been a test of her resilience, but she emerged stronger than ever. She had faced Barnes's bullying with courage, and now she was ready to use her voice to help others. With the case gaining national attention, she took the opportunity to advocate for more oversight in law enforcement, pushing for policies that would prevent people like Barnes from gaining unchecked power again. She was a fighter, and now she had a platform to make real change. For Maurice, the victory was bittersweet. He had set out to expose a corrupt officer, but what he found was a system that had allowed corruption to thrive. They had made a significant dent, but there was still so much more to do. But as he looked at Lisa, standing tall and proud beside him, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they had faced down the darkness, and they weren't going to stop now. This story wasn't just about Maurice or Lisa or even Barnes. It was about the power of standing up, even when the odds are stacked against you. It showed us that no matter how strong the systems of oppression might seem, they are not invincible. Barnes thought he was untouchable, but he was wrong, because when people stand together, when they find the courage to speak out and fight back, they can bring about real change. But the story also leaves us with questions. How many more are out there, hidden behind badges or titles, thinking they can act without consequences? How many more have suffered in silence, thinking there was no one to listen, no one to fight for them? Maurice's fight was a victory, but it's a reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing, and it needs all of us to be vigilant, to stand up when it's hard, and to support those who do. What did you think of the story? Have you ever felt like you were up against something bigger than you? And what did you do about it? We'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, your reflections. Leave a comment below, and let's keep this conversation going, because the more we talk, the more we understand, and the stronger we become together. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, please consider subscribing to our channel, Tales of Twist. We've got more stories that challenge, inspire, and surprise, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.